My name is Chris Flynn. I'm the books editor at The Big Issue and author of a novel, A Tiger in Eden, that came out a few months ago. And that's enough about me. You're all here to see Chad Harbach, who's the author of one of the most talked about novels of 2011 and now 2012, The Art of Fielding. Chad grew up in Wisconsin and he graduated from Harvard back in '97. He was a Henry Hoynes Fellow at the University of Virginia, where he received his MFA in fiction in 2004. He's currently the executive editor of N+1 magazine, one of the great literary journals, unsung literary journals, I think, over here in America, which he co-founded, and he lives in Brooklyn. We're going to talk about his novel, The Art of Fielding, today. Some of you might have seen this beautiful local edition. But please welcome Chad Harbach. Now, this book, for those of you who haven't had a chance to read the book yet, a brief little snippet about what the book's about. It's about the shortstop Henry Scrimshander, who goes to a fictional college, that's right, isn't it? Westish, and is taken under the wing of Mike Schwartz, who's a more senior athlete, who trains him up into a bit of a phenomenon. Whilst he's there, he has an intellectual gay mulatto roommate, Owen Dunn, who's also on the team. And Owen becomes the object of affection for the college president, Gert Affenleit. We'll talk about these names later, maybe. And Gert has never been with a man before. President Affenleit's estranged daughter, Pella, returns home, her marriage having failed, and she strikes up a romance with Mike Schwartz, who's been training Henry. And then Henry accidentally hits Owen in the head with his first errant throw of the season. And from that point on, everything he loses his confidence and everything begins to spiral into a whirlpool of destruction. Does that sound like a fair assessment of the book?
Yeah, for a long time I was thinking of calling the book Whirlpool of Destruction. But I thought better of it at the very last moment.
Yes, well, maybe you can have that title for the sequel, perhaps.
Yeah, the movie.
or the HBO series, Season 2. Whirlpool of Destruction, Art of Fielding 2. We'll talk about that a little bit in a second. Just to give us a bit of an idea of the tone of the novel, and we're going to talk a little bit about this too. Could you read a little excerpt from it for us?
Yeah, sure.
You're not really used to this edition, though, are you? You're used to the big...
No, it's very small. I need almost a glass to use.
A glass? You mean a magnifying glass?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I'll read a little bit, a very short chapter from early in the book. That Thanksgiving was Henry's first holiday away from home. He spent it at the dining hall, working his new job as a dishwasher. Chef Spiridakis, the head of dining services, was a tough boss, always marching around, inspecting your work. But the job paid more than Henry had ever made at the Piggly Wiggly in Langton. He worked the lunch and dinner shifts, and afterward, Chef Spiridakis gave him a sliced turkey breast to take back to Owen's mini-fridge. Henry felt a surge of homesick joy when he heard his parents' voices on the phone that night, his mom in the kitchen, his dad lying on his back in the family room with the TV on mute, ashtray by his side, half-heartedly doing the stretches he was supposed to do for his back. In Henry's mind, he could see his dad rolling his bent knees slowly from side to side. His pants rode up to his shins. His socks were white. Imagining the whiteness of those socks, the terrible clarity with which he could imagine it, brought a tear to Henry's eye. Henry! His mother's voice wasn't Thanksgiving cheery as he'd expected. It was chagrined, ominous, odd. Your sister told us that Owen... Henry wiped away the tear. He should have known that Sophie would spill the beans. Sophie always spilled the beans. She was as keen to get a rise out of people, especially their parents, as Henry was to placate them. Is gay. His mom let the word hang there. His dad sneezed. Henry waited. Your father and I are wondering why you didn't tell us. Owen's a good roommate, Henry said. He's nice. I'm not saying gay people aren't nice. I'm saying, is this the best environment for you, honey? I mean, you share a bedroom. You share a bathroom. Doesn't it make you uncomfortable? I sure hope so, said his dad. Henry's heart fell. Would they make him come home? He didn't want to go home. His total failure so far, to make friends, to get good grades, or even to find Mike Schwartz, made him more loath to go home than if he were having, like everybody around him seemed to be having, the world's most wonderful time. Would they put you in a room with a girl, his mom asked? At your age? Never. Never in a million years. So why would they do this? It makes no sense to me. If there was a flaw in his mom's logic, Henry couldn't find it. Would his parents make him switch rooms? That would be horrible, worse than embarrassing, to go to the housing office and request a new room assignment. The housing people would know instantly why he was asking, because Owen was the best possible roommate, neat and kind and rarely even home. The only roommate who'd want to be rid of Owen was a roommate who hated gay people. This was a real college, an enlightened place. You could get in trouble for hating people here, or so Henry suspected. He didn't want to get into trouble, and he didn't want a new roommate. His mom cleared her throat in preparation for a further revelation. We hear he's been buying you clothes. 2 weeks prior, on Saturday morning, Henry had been playing Tetris when Owen and Jason walked in. Owen, calm and chipper as always, Jason, sleepy-eyed and carrying a big paper cup of coffee. Henry closed the Tetris window, opened the website for his physics class. Hi, guys, he said. What's up? We're going shopping, said Owen. Oh, cool, have fun. The we is inclusive. Please put on your shoes. Oh, that's okay, Henry said. I'm not much of a shopper. But you're not a master of litotes, Jason said. Litotes. Henry repeated it to himself so that he could look it up later. When we get back, Jason said, I'm burning those jeans. What's wrong with these jeans? Henry looked down at his legs. It wasn't a rhetorical question. There was clearly something wrong with his jeans. He'd realized as much since arriving at Westish, just as he'd realized there was something wrong with his shoes, his hair, his backpack, and everything else. But he didn't know quite what it was. The way the Eskimos had 100 words for snow, he had only one for jeans. They drove in Jason's car to a mall in Door County. Henry went into dressing rooms and emerged for inspection over and over. There, Owen said, finally. These? Henry tugged at the pockets, tugged at the crotch. I think these are kind of tight. They'll loosen up, Jason said, and if not, so much the better. By the time they'd finished, Owen had said, there, finally, to 2 pairs of jeans, 2 shirts, and 2 sweaters. It was a modest stack, but Henry added up the price tags in his mind, and it was more than he had in the bank. Do I really need 2, he said. 1's a good start. 2, said Jason. Henry frowned down at the clothes. Oh, Owen slapped himself on the forehead. Did I forget to mention? I have a gift card for this establishment, and I have to use it right away, lest it expire. He reached for the clothes in Henry's hand. Here. But it's yours, Henry protested. You should spend it on yourself. Certainly not, Owen said. I would never shop here. He pried the stack from Henry's hands, looked at Jason. You guys wait outside. So now Henry had 2 pairs of jeans that had loosened up slightly, but still felt way too tight. As he sat by himself in the dining hall, watching his classmates walk by, he'd noticed that they looked quite a bit like other people's jeans. Progress, he thought. I'm making progress. Is that true, his dad said now? You've got this guy buying you clothes? Henry tried to think of a not untrue response. We went to the mall. Why is he buying you clothes? His mom's voice rose again. I doubt if he buys Mike Schwartz clothes, Henry's dad said. I doubt that very much. I think he wants me to fit in. Fit into what is maybe a question worth asking. Honey, just because people have more money than you doesn't mean you have to conform to their ideas about fitting in. You have to be your own person. Are we understood? I guess so. Good. I want you to tell Owen thank you very much, but you cannot, under any circumstances, accept his gifts. You're not poor, and you don't have to accept charity from strangers. He's not a stranger, and I already wore them. He can't take them back. Then he can wear them himself. He's taller than me. Then he can donate them to someone in need. I don't want to discuss this anymore, Henry. Are we understood? Henry didn't want to discuss it anymore either. It dawned on him, as it hadn't before, he was dense, he was slow, that his parents were 500 miles away. They could make him come home. They could refuse to pay the portion of his tuition they'd agreed to pay, but they couldn't see his genes. Understood, he said.
That's a great early passage from the novel that a lot of people probably think this is a baseball novel, but it's not a baseball novel, is it?
Well, it depends who you ask. I mean, it's. For me, it was the very first germ of the book really did have to do with baseball. Because the very first thing that I wanted to write about was this crisis that Henry goes through in the course of the book. He's this kind of preternaturally gifted player who's just sort of mesmerizing to watch, incredibly graceful, never makes a mistake.
Yeah.
And is sort of on the precipice of truly sort of great, real, like professional success. And then it all, not to give too much away, but it all sort of it quickly unravels for him
into a whirlpool of destruction. I think.
Part 2, whirlpool of destruction. But it's for no physical reason. It's just this sort of this bit of doubt that creeps in and kind of grows and expands and kind of takes over his mind and then his body. And I originally sort of became interested in this phenomenon because it's something that has happened to some really prominent professional ball players. And seeing this happen as a fan, it makes these kind of stoic and heroical guys incredibly sort of vulnerable, and it kind of lays bare the workings of their minds, which athletes don't really want to reveal. They want to, they express certain kinds of emotion out there on the field, but they never really want you to know what they're thinking, and that, and that's why, an interview with an athlete is generally the dullest thing in the world, right? Because they just they don't want you to know what's going on in their heads. It's not useful for them to reveal what goes on in their heads, so they sort of repeat the same cliches over and over and over again. I just want it to be aggressive and stay in the moment, and it's terrible. It's terrible to listen to. I was fascinated by this phenomenon, of the mind kind of intervening and taking over. So that was the first glimpse of the book. But I also, very early on, said, boy, I really don't want to write a novel that's all about baseball. It's not the sort of thing I would want to read. There are very few sports books that I really find myself attached to. So it very quickly. So for me, I very quickly, almost immediately was trying to find ways to kind of broaden the scope, bring in characters who were going to sort of care nothing about the game, and make it sort of more multifarious.
Could it easily have been another sport that was discussed in the book? Could it have been NFL or basketball?
I think baseball's. Well, oftentimes when athletes, I think, go through this kind of crisis, it happens in different sports. I think very often it happens in individual sports, because it happens when the spotlight is just right on you, and you can't deflect it, and you can't sort of hide in the mass of people, so it couldn't really happen in American football, where everyone just sort of crashes into one another, and it gets you hardly know what happened. It happens to tennis players with their serve.
Yeah, you hear them choking.
Yeah, and but so for me, what was very interesting about baseball was that it combined the. It's very interesting to write about a team game because I really wanted to write about the sort of dynamics of a team, the relationships among the players, and the way that those things ebb and flow over time. Also, the kind of, I wanted to try to emulate the kind of weird music of like locker room conversation and bus conversation and these sorts of things. So I think baseball is sort of unique in which, because you have that, of course it's a team game, but then you also have this kind of loneliness out on the field. Because, whether you're the batter, the pitcher, the fielder, everyone is very spaced out. And when the action comes to you, it's that same sort of spotlit effect.
Yeah, it zooms in on the individual.
Yeah. So I think it's this interesting combination of a sort of society of players, but then a real sort of solitude of the individual in the moment of performance.
Because the condition is named after, it's called Steve Blass disease, is that right?
Yes.
So it's named after a baseball player.
Yeah.
And the idea is that whenever they say they're fielding, they pick up the ball, they go to throw it, and they just physically can't throw. Is that?
Yeah, you just and it happens to some infielders. Steve Blass was actually a pitcher, so he starts with the ball, and Steve Blass was a very, very good pitcher who, and this was in the early 1970s, so a little bit before I was born, but he was a great pitcher. His team won the World Series, and then a year later, all of a sudden, he just couldn't do it anymore, and he was just throwing the ball all over the place. And I've always been intrigued by this question of, he couldn't possibly have been the first person this ever happened to,
of course,
right? But because he was so prominent, it got named after him, very, very sadly. And I actually, I was in Los Angeles last week, about to get on the plane to come over here, and all of a sudden I realized I had a voicemail on my phone, and it was Steve Blass. What? And he'd called me up, and and he's about 70 years old and lives in Pennsylvania, and he left I was like, oh my God. He left a very reassuring message because he was kind enough to spend about the first 60 seconds of his message reassuring me that he wasn't upset with me, for sort of dredging this up in my book. And he was like, it's nothing negative. I'm really pleased to make your acquaintance, and I'd love to talk. And so
if I ever meet you, I'll kill you.
If I ever meet you, I'm sure he's a very robust 70-year-old man, and I'd be frightened of him. But yeah.
But the theme of this loss, the idea of losing one's confidence, is quite a common theme for the other characters too. Not even the characters that are involved in the game. And Pella's got a huge loss of confidence because she's taken a hit with her marriage. And even President Gert Affenleit, he's got a real loss of confidence later on in life because he had a very early academic peak because he discovered the what's his name, the So Gert peaked early too, and then he's had a bit of a loss of confidence, doesn't really know what to do with himself. Was confidence such a strong theme in it because it took you so long to write? Did you not feel confident whenever you were writing it? It took 9 years to write, is that correct?
Yeah, even a little more, actually. It was between the time that I began the book and the time it was published was really 11 years. But I think it wasn't actually... I think it was less that. Because I think a lot of those... I think that certainly is a theme and a concept that runs throughout the book. But I think that was there very early on. And so I think it had less to do with the kind of length of the composition and the sort of later struggles with the composition than it had to do with my own kind of crises of confidence very early on in the process. Being a young writer, being in my early and mid-20s, and wanting desperately to become a writer. This is kind of the only thing that I, at that point in my life, really desperately wanted to do, and I'd kind of, really sort of put all of my eggs in that basket.
You sure did. Yeah.
But it wasn't at all clear that it was going to work out. And I was not a very confident writer, and I was in some ways probably, I mean, my lack of confidence hampered me. On the other hand, I was probably in some ways right not to be very confident because I also was not a very good writer at that point. So I think it came. So I think it came less, from my struggles in like year 7, year 8, than it did from those early years, and just wanting so badly to, all I sort of wanted out of life was to eventually write something that I guess we'll just power through that. To sort of write something that would sort of, that was anywhere near as good as the books that I, liked so much. Right. But it felt impossible. And so everything I was writing was just not living up to this standard that I had set for myself. And so I think, and I mean, you mentioned President Affenlight, and I think you're right. I mean, I think he's had this crisis of confidence a couple of times in his life. And he's in the time that the book takes place, he's 60 years old. But I kind of, when I tell his backstory, I tell about the time when he was in his 20s and desperately wanted to be a novelist.
That's right.
And for years kind of plugs away at this, and just his standard for himself is so high that he just comes nowhere near reaching it. And so for Guert, what he does is he eventually just burns out, gives up, and he just dives into reading as a sort of respite from trying to write, and so in this sort of sidewise way makes himself into a great academic, and it's this sort of diversion, from what he really wanted to do. And then he wakes up one day and he realizes, I'm a really excellent, kind of first-rate academic, which just sort of happened accidentally because I couldn't do the thing that I wanted to do.
Do you think when you were writing the character, he was an example of what you were afraid you might become?
I mean, he's a pretty cool guy.
Yeah, he is. He is. I'm not saying that's an unpleasant thing. But,
yeah, but it was a way of. Certainly. Yeah, it was a way of. I write. There are a few sort of explicit passages in the book about the difficulty of writing. That come from Guert's perspective and which come directly from what I was going through. In those days. But also at a certain point in writing Henry's Crisis, I was, when Henry sort of really plunged into self-doubt and he's at a very low point, in writing that character, I was drawing somewhat on my own experience as an athlete and on some close friends of mine who were very better athletes than I. But I think what I was really drawing from was my efforts to become a writer. So I think in Henry's struggle too, I was really kind of thinking about what was, happening to me sitting at my desk every day. But it's much more interesting to talk about that in terms of a baseball player.
Because even once you finished the book, it had a bit of trouble finding a home, didn't it? You had trouble finding an agent for a while, and then
I had a lot of trouble. Yeah, I had trouble finding an agent. And I finally finished a full draft of the manuscript that went all the way from the beginning to the end at the very end of 2009. And I had recently lost my job at that point, so I was in some real financial trouble. My roommate was paying my rent. I was in serious arrears to him. And I was in a bit of a bad way.
And you hadn't earned very much over those whole years when you were writing that, right? I heard your average salary was about $20,000 a year or something during that time.
Yeah, maybe 20 something. I had a lot of other things that I wanted to do because some friends of mine and I had founded N+1 magazine in 2004, and so I spent, I was working on the magazine in full-time but unpaid capacity. And of course, I also wanted to write, and so I spent a lot of time writing. So I was just sort of always barely working enough to get by, which was fine until I lost my job, and then I had no sort of cushion, and so then it became not fine. So, and this happened just a couple months before I finished the manuscript.
Right.
And then I finished the manuscript. I was borrowing money. I showed the manuscript to a couple of friends of mine who I trusted, and I don't even know if they read it. They just said, "Yeah, Chad, send the thing out for God's sakes. We've been waiting like 10 years for this, And I was like, "Thanks, guys." And I started to send the book around to agents, and yeah, I got a very unresounding response. I had a list of 8 agents to whom I wanted to send the book, and I sent it to them. One of them said, "I do not want to read this book." 7 of them agreed to read it. 6 of them read it and said, "No, thank you." And then the last one, the wisest, the great genius among them, was actually like truly ecstatic about it, and called me up and was like, I'm so, and wrote me these sort of love emails, and he was so enamored of the book, and was also just thoroughly convinced that and he was a very young guy. He was 27 at the time, so in some ways just starting out as an agent,
right?
And was totally convinced that every uber powerful agent in New York was just hot on my tail, And so he was like, "Let's go out to lunch," and I said, "Great," because normally I don't have money to eat lunch. And so we went to a very fancy place, but I was too nervous to eat anything. And at a certain point in the lunch, we were sort of chit-chatting, and he had been a good baseball player actually when he was young, and we spent some time talking about baseball. And then there came a time in the lunch when this sort of change, a sea change, came over his face, and it came time to do the hard sell.
Okay.
And he shifted, he sat up in his seat, and he shifted into this mode, and he started to sort of name by name all of the other agents who he thought were desperate to have me, and started to tell me why he was better than they were. And it was quite compelling and convincing, but I just sat there, very stoically, because I didn't want to give away the fact that there was no competition whatsoever. and so then I went home after lunch, and I waited what seemed like a seemly quantity of time, and then I called him back and I said, "Yeah, why don't we try this thing, you and me?" And so that was, but it was, so I was, on the one hand, I was thrilled about Chris, my agent, from the start. It was very clear that he just was, for one thing, a really sharp guy, and also just kind of understood the book in the deepest possible way. And I was, so I hope that even if all these other people had been interested, I still would have wound up with him,
right? Because
he's just been a godsend for me. But it was also sort of a disheartening process to be, because, and it wasn't that I ever thought that the book, the whole time I was writing the book, I certainly was not at all convinced that it had sort of commercial potential, Did
you ever think anyone would even read it when you were?
Well, I thought, well, if I can pull this off, it will be a pretty good book, and someone will publish it, and I'll be happy about that. But I never thought that it would necessarily reach a wide audience. And for one thing, it's I thought, well, on the one hand, I'm writing this book that's all about baseball, and so that's a limited sort of audience. And then on the other hand, it has all this gay stuff in it, and so that is like my two potential audiences have totally canceled each other out. and and so, but when I was turned down by all these agents, it kind of reinforced that idea for me that this was never going to be a commercially really viable sort of book. And then I signed up with Chris, and there were some things I wanted to tweak, so I went back and I worked for another 2 months. And at the end of those 2 months, we sent the book out to publishers, and then the publishers just had the absolutely opposite reaction.
Yeah, it was a crazy frenzy over the book. Yeah.
There was
I'm quite interested in your portrayal of stereotypes in sport, which is a very and homosexuality in sports. You've got a whole gay intergenerational romance thing going on here, and strangely, I haven't seen that mentioned in many reviews. In fact, it's almost glaringly absent from a lot of reviews. This central love story that goes on in the book. Has this raised any eyebrows, this sort of reversal of stereotype in sports? I mean, here in Australia, for example, there are no gay AFL players, apparently. I don't know if there's many gay rugby players, there's very few who would have come out. In the UK, soccer players, you never hear of any gay soccer players. But you've just come... 2, are there? Right, yeah. That's two amongst many. But has this raised any eyebrows for you in the US?
How do you mean just just the fact of the gay relationship?
Yeah, just having a gay sports relationship.
Yeah, I mean it's fun. It's there's been all sorts of different reactions. I mean, of course the climate is much the same or worse in the U.S. Not that long ago there was a former NBA player who came out and wrote a book about it. And in a way, I mean, this was past his playing days, but he was almost the sort of first, even former professional athlete in the States who had come out. So the reaction, it's funny because I think it's how would I put it? I mean, I've seen a lot of different reactions. I mean, I think I've noticed for one thing, like a sort of weird reluctance to talk about it among people who have read and loved the book, because they almost want to sort of trick other people into they want to like not they were like just read it, because I think there's almost this sort of like there's almost this sort of way in which and I've seen this too, where the book kind of draws in people who might, if you told them in advance, might be averse to this part of the story, who would say that is not this. I'm not interested in reading that book, and then they read the book and they're like, oh, but actually I really liked it, and then they're confused maybe about about themselves or their beliefs or something. So it's been, it has been. It's very hard. So it's very hard to describe the conversation about the book in terms of the gay story, because I think that, and I have certainly seen, people. I've certainly seen, there was a certain moment in time right when the book came out when I made the mistake of like looking at the reviews on Amazon.
Yes.
And that was really interesting and frightening, because there were obviously, because one thing that happened was that right when the book came out, we had a great boon, which was that there was an excerpt from the book in Sports Illustrated, which was a sort of dream come true for me, because that was the first magazine that I ever subscribed to.
The calendar issue, right?
What's that?
The calendar issue.
Oh yeah, well, the calendar issue was a whole other thing, because when I was I don't know, maybe I was 11 years old when I started subscribing to Sports Illustrated, and very mysteriously, and at the time, the calendar issue, as you call it, or the swimsuit issue, as
Swimsuit
we
issue.
say,
Sorry. Yeah.
it wasn't an entire issue, but it was a sort of section of an
sealed
issue.
section.
And so, very mysteriously, every February, I would get this issue of Sports Illustrated, and it was very clear that a large chunk of it had been ripped out. And the staples in the center were sort of were undone. And I mulled this over for a long time, tried to figure out what was going on. Of course, it turned out that like my whole sort of sexual development was contained in that undone staple. So anyway, Sports Illustrated, and then Sports Illustrated decided to do this excerpt, and which I was just so pleased about, and I think that sold an awful lot of copies of the book, right. To sports fans in various parts of Middle and Western and Southern America, who then went and ordered the book on Amazon and got a certain way into the book and were so pissed. And so the only thing that you can do is, whether you bought the book on Amazon or not, is to go on Amazon and give the thing 1 star and just be like, this is the worst book ever. Like, don't waste your money on this thing. And so there are a lot of those. I don't know if I answered your question at all.
Stupid question, anyway. I'm wondering, when you were writing about physical activities, there's a lot of physical training in this. Henry he really transforms physically from a kind of a small guy into quite a big guy, and Mike works him all the time in the gym. When you're writing about such intense physical activities, do you become more physical? And do you enter into a regime whenever you're writing it? Did you hear Mike Schwartz in your head saying, get down and give me 10 paragraphs, Harbach?
No, I don't think it helps. I don't think that writing about it makes you do it. I think that one thing that about writing and about being a writer, that I found very difficult in the early years was that I had lived a sort of very physically active sort of life. I had been a fairly serious athlete for a certain period of my life, and I also and I worked some sort of laborious jobs for a certain part of my life, and then you kind of shift, you stop doing some of those things, and you're like, I'm just going to write, and maybe some of the time when I was writing, I was also working some sort of really sedentary sort of job, and your life becomes really sort of intensely sedentary, and at a certain point that just starts to ruin your mind. I think it's really terrible for you. So I've learned over the years that because you just can't, if you sit at your desk 10 hours a day, you're gonna get really old really fast. So I think I learned over the years that you can't live like that. Yeah. And and maybe in the early years there was almost a sort of wish fulfillment going on, where instead of leading a sort of active life, I was just sort of writing about other people who did.
We have about 10 minutes left to go, ladies and gentlemen, so we'll field some questions from the floor. If anyone would like to ask Chad a question. Oh, that was fast. Oh, wait just a second. We are filming this, so if you could wait for the microphone to come, so that... There we go.
Thank you. Beautiful book, by the way.
Thanks.
I just wanted to ask about the evolution of the book and the story and the characters. You wrote it for, over the course of 11 years, sorry.
Yeah.
What was the genesis of the story? Did it change on the way through? Did the characters change? Did the story change? And also, at what point did you know along that, in that last moment, stretch, at what point did you know you were finished with it?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, it's a bit strange for me to look back on that whole long process and to realize that actually the book that I had in mind very, very early on, very much like the book that I wound up writing. as I said before, the book the very first germ of the book was Henry's crisis. But I very quickly had the 5 main characters. I very quickly had the setting of Westish College. And I very quickly, I think, had the sort of feeling tone of the book. And I knew, and I didn't know everything that was going to happen along the way, but I had a couple mileposts in mind. So, in some ways, I think the book that I wanted to write in the first year was an awful lot like the book that I did wind up with in the end. It just took me a very, very long time to figure out how to do it and how to make the thing on the page match the thing that was in my mind.
As to how did you know when it was finished, that's a good question, because as you said earlier, there's so much in there that could be added to it.
Yeah. When I talked earlier about when I sent the book off, to agents, and I did that because I had gotten to the end. Not necessarily because I felt like the project was finished, but because I'd gotten to the end, I really needed to move on in my life, and so I just had to do it. And then we sold the book. I got some edits from my editor. I sort of hunkered down to edit the book. I had about 5 months to do so. And that was and I spent, for those 5 months, I spent like 12, 14 hours a day writing. Which actually felt like a very small amount of time, because it's a long book, So in a way, you can only do sort of superficial things in 5 months. But those 5 months were really, really gratifying for me, because I was suddenly having this kind of sensations that I had never been having before, which was, this part is done. This chapter is exactly what I want it to be. This chapter is exactly what I want it to be. And so you're getting this like very great sense of accomplishment that you were totally lacking for the first 10 years. So for me, like those last couple of months when I really, really felt like it was getting done was just kind of a real sort of best time of my life in some ways.
Good question, thank you. Anyone else?
Hi, Chad. I just wanted to say, you just said 5 main characters, and certainly I think that's true, and I think all the characters are really well realized and very flawed, but the character, I'm just having a mental block now, Owen, he seems to be he's very talented, he's very funny, and I don't know if it's a coincidence, but he's also the most silent character in the book. I wondered if you had trouble writing in his voice, or because I don't know if he has many chapters which you see from his perspective, but certainly you see many from all the other characters' perspectives, and I wondered why that was. Yeah,
because he often just sits reading, doesn't he? He doesn't say a lot of the time.
Well, yeah, he has a lot to say, that guy. But there's no part of the book that is narrated from Owen's point of view. You're right, and. There is the reason for that is actually, and I don't know if it's a reason that will make sense to anyone but me, but, there was always this way as I was writing the book in which sort of deep in the back of my mind, I felt as if this book actually was in some way sort of being written by Owen, that this could easily be sort of Owen looking years later, looking back on his time at Westish College and sort of trying to figure things out and write these things from the perspectives of his friends at that point in his life. So to me, Owen, and it's not that I was thinking about this all the time or doing this in a really explicit sort of way, but I just sort of had this sense of Owen as kind of like the master consciousness of the book. And so there were times when I said, oh, maybe I should do this chunk from Owen's point of view, and I would start to write Owen, and I would almost inevitably start to write him in the first person. I could have included that. I could have done the book that way. It would have, probably taken me another couple of years, and the book would be another 200 pages long. But I eventually just decided to let him kind of exist in the middle of the thing, but to be a little more inscrutable than the rest.
Any other questions?
I wonder if I could get you to talk a little more directly about masculinity, because it seems like a lot of this discussion has been about that, and the kind of the aboutness of the novel seems to be about the difficulties and complexities of being a man.
Yeah, it's hard to be a man. Really early in the process, I had that explicit thought, that this was really ultimately mostly going to be a book about male friendships, male relationships, and that's certainly kind of probably the main reason why Moby Dick kind of hangs in the background of this book, because I think that Moby Dick is probably the preeminent American novel of male relationships, and kind of gets deeply involved in those relationships across a really sort of broad spectrum of possibilities, which ultimately is sort of what I was trying to do as well, and partly just because I think that at least in American culture, whether it's in movies or TV or even often in novels, relationships between men get portrayed in pretty like simplistic and reductive sorts of ways. I don't think men are just supposed to sort of grunt at each other, and and we have, of course, this sort of new cinematic tradition called the bromance, which has great currency but is also pretty stupid. And so I think part of my which is just to say, I think a lot of my project had to do with trying to represent like the relationships between young men in their sort of in as close to their like actual complexity as I could get it.
We've come to the end of the session, ladies and gentlemen. If you haven't read The Art of Fielding, I really highly recommend it. It's one of the favourite books I've read in the last year. It's written in this really warm raconteur style. It all reads as if Chad's sitting in a big armchair next to you, telling you the tale. So I strongly recommend it. Chad will be signing some books in Glee Bookstore just next door to us after the event. Thank you all for coming today, and please put your hands together for Chad Harbach.